talk to Nelson? Ready? Okay. Alright, so welcome back everyone. Today we're having a conversation with the author of that widely cited blog post, Let's Not Forget Translanguaging is a Political Act. Let's welcome to the show Professor Nelson Flores.
Hello.
Let's move straight to the topic of today's video, your blog post. The title itself is a pretty convenient place to start. What inspired you to write this particular post, and who is forgetting that translanguaging is a political act?
So I was introduced to the concept of translanguaging in grad school when I worked with Ofelia Garcia. In one of my grad seminars, we had page proofs for a book that was called Bilingual Education in the 21st Century. As I was reading these page proofs, what stood out to me the most about the analysis that she was giving, as someone who has always been a strong advocate for bilingual education, was the mismatch between the goals of bilingual education, which is balanced bilingualism or equal competency in standardized forms of two languages, and the program structures of bilingual education, which oftentimes encourage the strict separation of languages into kind of English time, partner language time. Right. The language practices that racialized bilingual communities actually use on a daily basis that don't fit neatly into this strict separation, that don't fit neatly into this balance. And I remember reading those page proofs and kind of having an aha moment where a lot of the things that I just took for granted as true were exposed to me as actually ideological, right? As not objective, as ideological descriptions that actually caused harm to the communities that I was hoping to advocate for. So reading these page proofs, I had a personal reaction to it as a Latino who grew up in a bilingual home. It really helped me to understand my own personal experiences of bilingualism, which never fit into these descriptions at all, right? But as a professional, as an educator, it also provided me a vocabulary for reconceptualizing how I represent the bilingualism of students and communities and how I work to educate those communities. And so, of course, when I was reading those page proofs, we had no idea how much the book was going to take off. The book was published in 2009. I wrote the blog post in 2014. And so within that 5-year span, the term kind of exploded in the kind of conference circuit. Everyone was using the term translanguaging. The blog post was written kind of in reaction to the ways that I was seeing the term being used, primarily in applied linguistic circles. So as the term translanguaging moved out of bilingual education circles into more general applied linguistic circles, I found that there was a shift in some of the ways that it was being discussed. That it was being discussed more as a kind of universal linguistic theory rather than a political vision wedded to broader efforts to dismantle dominant language ideologies. And so many people were treating translanguaging as an empirical question, kind of disentangle what counts as translanguaging and what doesn't count as translanguaging, and how can translanguaging help us to more accurately represent our research, and how can it make us more objective? And that's not my understanding of translanguaging at all. Translanguaging is not trying to be objective. Translanguaging is taking an explicit political stance and vision that really is thinking about how we connect these struggles around language to broader efforts to resist racial hierarchies both inside and outside of the classrooms.
So your second bullet point says translanguaging is not the same as code switching. Now we could probably spend the next 4 hours here trying to explain the differences. So let's stick with the political stuff. In your experience, what are a couple of those political beliefs translanguaging forces us to confront?
This is actually one bullet that I might revise if I were writing the blog post today. And I think it's because it gets caught up in kind of a terminological debate that I think distracts from the broader conceptual point that I was trying to make. I think what I might say now is that there are 2 points of entry into conceptualizing the language practices of racialized bilingual communities in research. One is that languages are ontologically real. And what I mean by that are that languages kind of exist in the world as objective categories, and that racialized bilingual communities switch between two or more of these categories. And so research from this perspective typically wants to understand the grammaticality of these moves between languages. And oftentimes, this types of research uses the term code switching, though not everyone who uses the term code switching necessarily adheres to this perspective. The second kind of way of conceptualizing these issues are languages as ideological constructs that have been reproduced within the context of European colonialism. Now, this doesn't mean that they aren't real, right, in the sense that they have real impacts on people's lives, but rather that they aren't ontologically real, and that they just kind of exist in the world as objective categories removed from any human intervention. These are human constructs, right, that have ideological origins. And so research from this perspective typically wants to understand how the borders constructed by these ideological constructs work to marginalize the language practices of racialized bilingual communities as a point of entry for working to dismantle these borders as part of broader efforts to promote social change. So often this type of research uses the term translanguaging, though not everyone who uses the term translanguaging necessarily adheres to this perspective, which I think was probably one of the points that I was grappling with in that blog post, where some of the people that I heard using the term translanguaging really seemed to be coming from the perspective that languages actually were ontologically real, and were actually subscribing to that kind of perspective on the issue. And so while I do think the terminological debate is a distraction, while I personally prefer the term translanguaging to code switching, is that the term code switching for me suggests that there are, quote, codes, or what we might call languages or dialects, that are ontologically real, and that the norm for human communication is to use just one of them at a time, with any use of more than one being a, quote, switch. And so I struggle with the kind of implication of the term itself, even if people aren't necessarily conceptualizing the practices in that way. And for me, I think translanguaging as a term helps to avoid some of these possible pitfalls.
So this blog post continues to be widely cited since 2014. Do you see educators preserving the political dimension of translanguaging, or do we still need to be reminding people about that part?
I actually don't think that it was ever educators that were missing the political dimensions of translanguaging. So in fact, Ofelia Garcia originally developed her conceptualization of translanguaging based on her work with bilingual educators, who she observed constantly crossing ideologically constructed linguistic borders in their classrooms, despite being told that they weren't supposed to be doing this, because they knew that it was the right thing to do, right? And they knew that it was what their students needed and deserved, and they knew that it was going to affirm their students' home language practices. And so I think for bilingual educators in particular, I think the political dimensions of what they were doing were always clear to them, and the stakes of what they were doing was always clear to them. I think it has been more researchers that have lost track of the political dimensions of translanguaging. I think this is less the case in bilingual education research, where the political dimensions are still widely discussed, and more the case in general applied linguistics research that I don't think has ever really fully captured the political dimensions of translanguaging to begin with. And so I think that moving forward, a way for applied linguists to really grapple with this political dimension is to stop treating translanguaging as an empirical question, but rather understanding it to be a political stance. And this political stance recognizes the ideological construction of linguistic borders, acknowledges the fact that all language practices cross these linguistic borders, brings attention to the power relations at play in hegemonic modes of perception that frame marginalized communities as crossing linguistic borders, while framing dominant communities as engaged in homogenous linguistic practices that don't cross borders, and accounts for the material impacts these discrepancies have in reproducing, maintaining, and further exacerbating social inequalities. hierarchies. So I think the types of questions that we can ask if we take this stance or this orientation are kind of thinking about what are the implications of this orientation in a specific context that I happen to be doing research in. What are the specific histories of ideological linguistic border construction that shapes this particular context where I'm doing research? Whose language practices get marked as heterogeneous in the sense that their border crossing is perceived as using multiple named languages or dialects or crossing linguistic borders? And whose linguistic practices are marked as homogeneous in the sense that their border crossing is perceived as not border crossing, right? As just using one homogeneous code, as using just one named language or dialect. And how does this discrepancy map on to broader social hierarchies? And how does this help to maintain and further reproduce those social hierarchies? And how, importantly, can our research that exposes this work to dismantle those social hierarchies?
Is there anything you would add or change about that original post?
Ironically, though the blog post has gotten most of its attention because of its focus on translanguaging, I think if I were to write it today, I would change the title to "Let's Not Forget That Representations of Language Are a Political Act," because I think that was really the key point that I was trying to make in the post. For too long, applied linguists have sought to position themselves, ourselves, as objectively describing language in the world. And I think it was efforts to mold translanguaging into this political project that I was noticing as I was making the conference rounds in 2014. I think changing this title would have also perhaps shifted the focus of the post a bit so that translanguaging would be a contested term, with some researchers using it as an effort to objectively describe the world and treating languages as ontologically real, and some of us committed to taking seriously our roles as researchers and grappling with the politics of representation in ways that seek to challenge oppressive language ideologies that are not just produced quote out there in the world, but are also kind of coming from inside the house of applied linguistics itself. And the more I've worked on these issues, the more I have come to realize that the words used are less important than the perspective that one is bringing to the conversation.
You had mentioned translanguaging helped you get into developing a raciolinguistic perspective. That sounds like an interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
One of the key questions that I brought with me to my doctoral studies was based on my experience as a high school ESL teacher in the Bronx. Many of my students were what New York City referred to as, quote, long-term English learners. And these are students who had been classified as English learners for 7 or more years and still had not been reclassified as fully English proficient. So in my doctoral program, I was fortunate enough to work with Kate Mencken and Tatiana Klein on a project focused on the student population, just as I was beginning to be introduced to translanguaging in my coursework with Ofelia Garcia. And translanguaging as an overtly political framing of racialized bilingualism offered us as a research team tools to begin to critically interrogate how it was possible that students who our research revealed engaged in bilingual language practices on a daily basis could be framed as not fully proficient in any language. A few years later, Jonathan Rosa and I, who have been good friends since we were undergraduates, decided we should write an article together. And I brought my evolving critique of dominant representation of students classified as long-term English learners, while Jonathan brought into the conversation his work focused on ideologies of languagelessness and his engagement with Miyako Inoue's work on the listening subject. And voila, we had the beginnings of a raciolinguistic perspective, which essentially argues that racialized bilingual communities are not the problem. The ways that their language practices are perceived is the problem, and that the solution then isn't to fix their language practices, but to fix these perceptions. My point of entry into these conversations was translanguaging, which opened up the space for me to call into question dominant representations of language, which is something that we pushed even further with our raciolinguistic perspective. I've always seen a raciolinguistic perspective as an extension of the foundations laid by translanguaging.
Speaking of a raciolinguistic perspective, you just released a new book. I've read it. It is effing awesome. What is the title of the book and what's it about?
The book is called Bilingualism for All, ? Raciolinguistic Perspectives on Dual Language Education in the United States. And I co-edited it with Amelia Zhang from American University and Nicholas Subtarelu at Georgetown University. And the question mark in the title, I think, speaks to the major questions that the book is grappling with. In particular, mainstream discussions of dual language programs that have the explicit goal of bringing students from different language backgrounds together to develop bilingualism and biliteracy often represent them as inherently socially transformative and anti-racist. And while these programs do important work in challenging the hegemony of monolingualism in the US, bringing a raciolinguistic perspective brings attention to the ways these programs often maintain and even exacerbate the racial inequities that many proponents of these programs purport to want to actually challenge. So the book includes an introduction and a conclusion where the editors, we lay out the general principles of a raciolinguistic perspective on these issues, and 11 amazing chapters written by scholars examining a range of different topics from this raciolinguistic perspective, ranging from peer interaction to parental and community involvement to school district and state policies, and include a range of different languages besides English, including Spanish, Korean, and Hebrew. And it ends with a beautifully written afterwards by Guadalupe Valdez, who wrote the original cautionary note in the late 90s, pointing to some of the racial dynamics that this book systematically documents in relation to dual language education. So you should definitely check it out.
Everybody, Nelson Flores. And we're done. Bye. Bye. Oh, God. All right, we're done.